Before we begin, if you enjoy tales that tiptoe between history and the haunted, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions, where every story is just boring enough to lull you into unease. Tonight's offering is a peculiar slice of Victorian dread, so settle in and let us wander together through the fog-draped gates of the past. Chapter 1. The Curse of Polite Partings. The Victorians, as you may know, were a people obsessed with death. They wore lockets of hair from departed lovers, photographed their dead as if they were merely sleeping, and built cemeteries so grand they rivaled the palaces of the living. But beneath all this macabre pageantry lay a web of superstitions so finely woven that even the most mundane gesture, a farewell for instance, could unravel into nightmare. Take, for example, the unassuming phrase, "Goodnight and die." A harmless pleasantry, you might think, a courtesy, but whisper it within the bounds of a Victorian cemetery, and you'd soon find yourself regretting your manners. The belief was simple. To say goodnighting among the graves was to extend an invitation. Not to the living, of course, but to those who lingered in the shadows, their fingers brushing the edges of our world, waiting for an opening. Our story begins with one such unfortunate soul, Reginald Pembleton, a clerk of middling stature and exceptional dullness. Reginald was not a man given to flights of fancy. He balanced ledgers, took his tea at precisely 4:30, and never, ever left the house without his umbrella. But even the most sensible of men can stumble into the absurd, and Reginald's stumble came on a damp October evening, as he took his customary shortcut through Highgate Cemetery. Now, Highgate was no ordinary burial ground. Its winding paths were lined with angels whose eyes seemed to follow you. Its mausoleums groaned like old men in their sleep, and its reputation for unsettling occurrences was so well established that even the local ruffians dared not linger after sunset. Reginald, however, was running late. His mistress of mathematics, a particularly stubborn column of figures, had detained him at the office, and so he ventured into the gloom, his boots crunching on the gravel like the teeth of some great beast. He had nearly reached the eastern gate when he heard it, a soft, rhythmic scraping like a trowel digging into earth. Reginald paused. The sound stopped. He took another step. The scraping resumed. Foolishly he turned. There, hunched over a fresh grave, was a figure in a tattered black coat, its back to him, its shoulders shuddering as if in laughter or sobs. Reginald, ever the gentleman, cleared his throat. "Good evening," he said. The figure went still. Then, with a slow, bone-creaking motion, it turned its head. Reginald saw no face, only a yawning darkness where features ought to have been. "Evening," the thing replied, its voice like wind through a hollow tree. But not good. Reginald's blood turned to ice. He backed away, muttering the first polite nothing that came to mind. "Well, good night, then." The moment the word left his lips, he knew he'd erred. The figure straightened, its coat billowing as if filled with unseen wings. "Night," it echoed. "Yes, I shall come with you then." Reginald fled. He did not remember sprinting through the cemetery gates, nor stumbling into his narrow little house on Whistler's Lane. But he would never forget the sound that followed him, a light, persistent eggy tapping at his door, as if someone were politely requesting entry. For 3 nights, the tapping continued. For 3 nights, Reginald lay awake, his curtains drawn, his breath shallow. On the 4th evening, exhausted beyond reason, he opened the door, just a crack, to peer into the street. There, on his threshold, stood the figure from the cemetery, its faceless head tilted in greeting. Behind it, stretching into the fog, were dozens more, pale shapes in rotting finery, their hands outstretched, their mouths whispering in unison. "You said good night. You invited us. Unsaid. Reginald Pembleton was never seen again. His house, however, remained occupied. Neighbors reported flickering lights in the windows, the sound of many footsteps on the stairs, and, most unnerving of all, the faint, cheerful chorus of voices bidding passers-by good night as they hurried past. So the next time you find yourself in a cemetery, as the clock strikes midnight, remember, silence is your ally. Nod, if you must. Tip your hat. But do not, under any circumstances, say a good night. The Victorians understood, as we have forgotten, that some invitations are too easily accepted, and some guests never leave. Chapter 2. Graveyard Shift. Keepers of the Dead. The cemetery watchmen of Victorian England were not paid to believe in ghosts. They were paid to walk. Miles and miles of it, night after night, through winding lanes of headstones and vaults that loomed like silent sentinels in the dark. Their lanterns cast trembling circles of light over the gravel paths, illuminating nothing but their own exhaustion. The job was simple, at least in theory. Dead or body snatchers shoo away vandals and, most importantly, never, under any circumstances, acknowledge the other things that moved among the graves. Alfred Dunning had been a watchman at Highgate Cemetery for 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days when he first noticed the footsteps. Not his own, those he knew by heart, the familiar drag of his left boot where the sole had worn thin, but another set, lighter, quicker, keeping pace just beyond the edge of his lantern's glow. At first, he chalked it up to rats, then to the wind. Then, when the steps began to echo his own pauses, to the kind of fatigue that made a man see things. But Alfred was a practical man. He had buried 2 wives, survived cholera, and once chased off a pair of resurrectionists with nothing but a rusted shovel and a convincingly deranged shout. If something was following him, he would face it head-on. One fog-choked midnight, he stopped abruptly, turned and held his lantern high. The footsteps halted. The air smelled of damp earth, and something older, something like the inside of a long-sealed tomb. "Show yourself," he growled. "Unsaid. Then, from behind a nearby obelisk, a figure stepped into view. It was a boy, or something shaped like one, dressed in a moth-eaten page's uniform, his face pale as a marble effigy. Alfred's breath hitched. He knew this boy. Or rather, he knew the grave he'd come from, a small, neglected plot near the cedar trees, where a child named Thomas Wicks had been buried 30 years prior after succumbing to a fever. The stone was crooked now, half sunk into the soil, but Alfred passed it every night on his rounds. "You are not real," Alfred said, more to himself than to the boy. The boy tilted his head. "Neither are you, most nights." Alfred blinked. The boy was gone. This was the unspoken truth of cemetery work. The dead were the least of a watchman's troubles. It was the living who were unpredictable. Grieving mothers who lingered until dawn, drunken gentlemen daring each other to spend the night in a crypt, and, of course, the ghouls. Not the folkloric kind that feasted on corpses, but the desperate ones, the ones who crept into graveyards to pry gold teeth from jaws or snip locks of hair to sell to jewelers. Alfred had seen it all. But the boy, Thomas, kept appearing. Sometimes he skipped ahead of Alfred on the path, his laughter like the chime of a broken clock. Other times he sat cross-legged on his own grave, humming a tuneless song. Alfred never spoke to him again, but he began leaving things. A peppermint on the crooked headstone, a tin soldier with its paint worn away. It felt foolish, but no more so than the rest of the job. Then came the night the strangers arrived. Alfred heard them before he saw them, muffled voices, the scrape of metal against earth. He followed the sounds to an older section of the cemetery, where the wealthy lay entombed in ivy-covered mausoleums. 3 men clustered around one such structure, their faces obscured by scarves, their tools glinting in the moonlight. Body snatchers. Or worse. Alfred tightened his grip on his lantern and stepped forward. "This is private property," he said, his voice steady. The men turned. One grinned, revealing a mouthful of crooked teeth. "And we're private citizens. Move along, old man." Alfred didn't move. He'd been threatened before. But then he saw what they carried. Not shovels, but crowbars, and a canvas sack that bulged ominously. These weren't resurrectionists. They were after something else entirely. "You don't want to do this," Alfred said quietly. The leader laughed. "And why is that?" Behind them, a shadow detached itself from the trees. Small, be familiar. Totekuntai, this mind. The boy, Thomas, walked forward, his bare feet making no sound on the grass. The men didn't see him. Not at first. Alfred held his ground. "Because," he said, "you're not alone here." Thomas smiled. Then he opened his mouth, wider than a child's mouth should go, and let out a sound that wasn't a scream, wasn't a laugh, but something in between. The men froze. The leader's grin faltered. And then the other shadows began to move. Alfred didn't stay to watch. He walked away, his boots crunching on the gravel, his lantern swaying gently. Behind him the men's shouts turned to something else entirely. By morning they were gone. Only their tools remained, scattered around the mausoleum, as if dropped in a hurry. When the cemetery superintendent asked Alfred about the disturbance, he shrugged. "Just the wind," he said. And that was that. The next night, Alfred resumed his rounds. The gravel path stretched before him, the mist curling around the headstones like breath. Somewhere ahead, he knew, a small figure waited, perched on a crooked grave. Alfred reached into his pocket. The peppermints were still there. He walked on. The dead, after all, were the easiest company to keep. Chapter 3. The language of flowers and funerals. The Victorians were never ones to say things plainly when they could say them in petals. A bouquet was never just a bouquet. It was a conversation, a confession, sometimes a condemnation. Roses for love, lilies for purity, rosemary for remembrance. But in the quiet spaces between the living and the dead, flowers took on a far stranger language. Edith Harrow knew this better than most. She was Highgate Cemetery's unofficial florist, the woman the mourners sought when they needed more than mere condolences woven into wreaths. Her little shop, wedged between a cobbler and a pawnbroker on Cemetery Row, smelled perpetually of damp earth and wilted roses. The grieving came to her with trembling hands and hushed requests. You make it say, "Forgive me." Or more troublingly, make sure she knows it was him. He done. Edith never judged. She simply arranged. On the morning of October 31st, a gentleman, if one could call him that, entered her shop. His coat was finely tailored but streaked with mud at the hem, as though he'd taken a shortcut through the graves. His gloves were too white, too new, out of place on hands that looked like they'd never done an honest day's work. He did not give his name. "I need something for a grave," he said, his voice smooth as polished oak. "Something meaningful?" Edith wiped her hands on her apron. "Meaning is my specialty, sir. Who is the recipient?" The man's lips twitched. "My late wife." Edith had heard that tone before, the careful neutrality of a man who was anything but neutral. She studied him. His cravat was perfectly knotted, his hair pomaded into submission, but his eyes, dark and depthless, were the kind that didn't reflect light. "And what would you like to say to her?" Edith asked. The man smiled. "That I miss her." A lie. Edith knew it in the way his fingers tapped against the counter, restless as a spider testing its web. But business was business. "Very well," she said. "White lilies for purity, ivy for fidelity, Perhaps some forget-me-nots. The man's smile sharpened. No, something stronger. I want her to understand. Edith paused. Then slowly, she reached beneath the counter and drew out a small wooden box. Inside were flowers she kept for special clients. The ones who didn't just want to mourn, but to unspeak. Marigolds, she said, lifting a handful of golden petals. For grief and sorrow. She added a sprig of yew. For death. The man nodded, approving. Then his gaze landed on something else in the box. A cluster of belladonna blooms, their purple throats dark as bruises. And those? Edith's fingers tightened around the stems. A nightshade. For falsehood. For deceit. The man laughed, a sound like ice cracking underfoot. Perfect. Edith worked in silence after that, weaving the flowers into a wreath so dense it seemed to pulse in her hands. When she was done, the man paid her in coins that felt unnaturally cold. "Will you be laying it yourself?" she asked. "No," he said, taking the wreath. "I've hired a boy to do it." Edith watched him leave, the wreath dangling from his hand like a severed head. She should have let it go. But that night, as the clock struck midnight, she found herself walking the cemetery path, her lantern casting long shadows over the graves. She found the wreath atop a fresh plot, its soil still loose. The name on the stone was Gelinor Voss, beloved wife. The marigolds had already begun to blacken at the edges. Edith sighed. She knew better than to interfere, but some messages were too cruel to deliver. She reached for the wreath and froze. The grave was moving. Not the earth, not the worms beneath it, but something else, a slow, sinuous shift, as though the soil itself were breathing. Then, with a sound like tearing silk, a hand burst forth, fingers splayed, dirt crumbling from its pale skin. Edith stumbled back. The hand groped blindly, found the wreath, and dragged it down into the earth. For a moment, silence. Then, from deep below came a whisper, not in words, but in scent. The cloying sweetness of marigolds, the bitter tang of yew, and underneath it all, the unmistakable venom of nightshade. The grave shuddered. Then it was still. Edith didn't wait to see if the hand returned. She walked home, her steps quick but steady, her mind already turning over the day's orders. Tomorrow, a widow would come asking for roses. A mother would request daisies for a child's grave. Life and death would go on. But as she unlocked her shop door, she caught a whiff of something on the air. Marigolds, pumpkin, visor. Nightshade. Edith smiled. Some messages, it seemed, were best delivered in person. Chapter 4. Moonlit Mourning. When grief walked at night. There were rules to mourning in Victorian England, as intricate and unyielding as the iron gates of Highgate Cemetery itself. A widow wore black for 2 years, moved through society like a shadow, and never, God forbid, attended parties. But the most peculiar rules governed not how one grieved during the day, but how one was expected to mourn when the moon rose. The cemetery's night watchmen knew this better than anyone. They saw the women who came after midnight, their black crepe dresses whispering against the gravel paths, their faces veiled even when no living soul remained to see them. These weren't mere mourners. These were the true bereaved, the ones who couldn't bear to weep under the judgmental eye of the sun. Mrs. Lillian Graves, an unfortunate name, she often thought, had become something of a regular. Every Thursday, rain or shine, she arrived at Highgate's North Gate precisely at 12:30, carrying a lantern with a single candle flickering behind red glass. The watchman nodded as she passed. They knew better than to question a veiled woman, and she made her way to the same plot, the same headstone, Charles Graves, taken too soon. On this particular night, however, something was different. Lillian felt it the moment she stepped onto the path. The air was heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic like old blood. Her lantern's light seemed weaker, the red glow barely reaching beyond her own gloved hands. Still, she walked on. When she reached Charles' grave, she froze. Someone was already there. A figure knelt before the headstone, their back to her, their black coat pooling around them like spilled ink. For a wild moment, Lillian thought it might be Charles himself, somehow risen, somehow returned. But then the figure turned, and she saw the face beneath the hood. It was a woman. Or rather, it had been a woman once. Now her skin clung too tightly to her bones, her lips peeled back in a grimace that might have been a smile, might have been a snarl. Her eyes were polished black, reflecting Lillian's lantern in twin pinpricks of red. "You're late," the woman said. Lillian's breath caught. She had never seen this creature before, yet somehow she knew her. This was the other kind of mourner, the kind who didn't just visit the dead, but stayed. I come every week," Lillian managed. The woman tilted her head. "Do you?" And then Lillian remembered. The first time she had come to Charles' grave at midnight, she hadn't been alone. There had been another woman here, a stranger shrouded in black, kneeling at the foot of a nearby plot. They had never spoken, but Lillian had felt an understanding pass between them, the silent camaraderie of those who grieved beyond the bounds of daylight. That had been 5 years ago. Lillian's hands trembled. "You're still here." The woman's grin widened. "Grief doesn't leave, just because you do." A chill prickled down Lillian's spine. She thought of all the nights she'd come here, all the tears she'd shed into the earth, all the whispered promises to Charles that she would never forget him. Had she ever truly left? Or had some part of her stayed here, kneeling in the dirt, until it had worn her down to something as gaunt and hungry as the woman before her? The woman stood, her bones creaking like old floorboards. "They don't tell you, do they? When you start mourning at midnight, they don't warn you how easy it is to lose track of time." Lillian took a step back. The woman took a step forward. "Look at you," the woman murmured. "Still wearing black. Still carrying that lantern. Still clinging to a ghost." Her skeletal fingers brushed Lillian's cheek. "When do you suppose you'll stop?" Lillian didn't have an answer. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. The woman sighed, as if disappointed. "Thursday nights," she said. "Always Thursday nights." Then she turned and walked away, her form dissolving into the shadows between the graves. Lillian stood there for a long time, the red light of her lantern staining the grass like blood. When she finally moved, it wasn't toward Charles' grave, but back down the path toward the gate. She didn't run, but she didn't look back either. The watchmen saw her leave. They noted the way her steps were quicker than usual, the way her shoulders hunched as if against a cold wind. They said nothing. After all, they had seen it before. Midnight mourners never stayed forever. But sometimes they didn't leave either. Chapter 5. The Case of the Chatty Corpse. Mrs. Eugenia Holloway had been the subject of considerable neighborhood speculation ever since she began holding nightly conversations with her late husband. It started, as these things often do, with perfectly ordinary grief. Theodore Holloway had departed this mortal coil quite suddenly, after mistaking a bottle of laudanum for his evening cordial, leaving Eugenia with nothing but his substantial debts and an impressive collection of taxidermied squirrels. At first, her nightly visits to Highgate Cemetery were unremarkable. She would arrive at dusk with a small folding stool, a thermos of weak tea, and sit quietly at Theodore's graveside for precisely 1 hour. The watchmen tipped their hats as she passed. The other mourners gave her respectful distance, and even the cemetery's more restless spirits seemed content to leave her be. Then came the talking. Not whispering prayers, not murmuring fond reminiscences. Full, spirited conversation, complete with pauses for responses. "Theodore, you'll never guess what Mrs. Pettigrew said at the sewing circle today," Eugenia would announce, settling onto her stool with the air of someone preparing for a particularly juicy gossip session. A pause. "Then? No, I shan't forgive her for that comment about your sideburns, and neither should you." Another pause. "Well, yes, I suppose you're right. She did always have terrible taste in hats." It was one thing to mourn. It was quite another to conduct what appeared to be a lively dialogue with a slab of granite. Alfred Dunning, ever the pragmatic watchman, first assumed senility. The vicar suspected demonic influence. The local physician prescribed leeches and a vigorous course of cold baths. But when the widow Holloway began relaying shockingly accurate predictions about stock market fluctuations, information her decidedly unbusiness-minded husband could never have known in life, the peculiar case took a turn toward the inexplicable. "He says the railway shares will plummet by Thursday," Eugenia informed her skeptical brother-in-law over tea. "Something about mismanaged funds and a bridge collapse in Yorkshire." "Preposterous," he scoffed. Until Thursday came, and so did the news of the Yorkshire Bridge disaster. Soon half of London's bereaved were flocking to Highgate, not to mourn their own dead, but to eavesdrop on Eugenia's nightly consultations. Some brought notebooks. Others brought offerings of cake, hoping to curry favor with whatever spectral intermediary was providing such excellent financial advice. The cemetery superintendent, torn between maintaining decorum and his own growing curiosity, took to lurking behind obelisks with a pocket watch, timing the pauses in Eugenia's conversations as if measuring the speed of the afterlife's telegraph service. The truth, when it came, was both simpler and stranger than anyone anticipated. One damp November evening, as Eugenia held forth on the scandalous price of eggs, 3 pence each, Theodore, criminal really, a particularly bold mourner crept forward to press his ear against the Holloway headstone. "Well?" demanded the crowd. The man paled. It's answering her." A hush fell. Highgate Cemetery had heard many unnatural sounds over the years. The clanking of chains, the wailing of banshees, the occasional spectral bagpipe, but never anything as unsettling as a dead stockbroker politely debating grocery prices. The superintendent, sensing the impending hysteria, made a show of inspecting the grave. What he discovered was neither ghost nor ghoul, but something far more mundane. A dislodged drainage pipe running from the Holloway plot straight into an active sewer line. The gurgles, drips, and occasional watery echoes had, through some alchemy of grief and imagination, become Theodore's voice in Eugenia's ears. "Madam," the superintendent said gently, "your husband isn't speaking to you. That's the contents of the Mortlake branch of the public sewer system." Eugenia considered this. She folded her stool with dignity. Then, with the air of a woman who had survived worse embarrassments, she turned to the stone and said, "Theodore, if this is one of your pranks, I shan't forgive you until Christmas." A bubble rose from the damp earth with a sound uncannily like a chuckle. The crowd dispersed after that, some disappointed, others relieved. The cemetery returned to its usual quiet, broken only by the occasional sob or the rustle of a well-meaning relative arranging flowers. As for Eugenia, she still visits Theodore every week, though now she brings a picnic blanket instead of a stool. And if she sometimes pauses to let the sewer pipes have their say, well, who's to say the dead don't speak in mysterious ways? After all, as she often remarks to the empty air, it's not as though anyone else was offering stock tips. Chapter 6. Gaslight and Ghosts, Lighting the Way for Spirits. Progress, as the Victorians were fond of declaring, was inevitable. Cobblestones gave way to paved roads, candles to oil lamps, and then, glory of glories, to gaslight. The great cemeteries of London, never ones to be left in the Dark Ages or the dark at all, eagerly installed rows of gleaming new gas lamps along their winding paths. No longer would mourners risk twisting an ankle in the gloom. No longer would watchmen need to squint at suspicious figures lurking behind mausoleums. And, as it turned out, no longer would the dead need to stumble about blindly in the afterlife. The first sign that something was amiss came from the lamplighter himself, a wiry fellow named Jem Hawkins, who prided himself on his steady hand and punctual schedule. It was Jem who noticed that the lamps along the western avenue of Highgate Cemetery burned through their gas at twice the rate of the others. No matter how he adjusted the valves, by midnight those particular flames would be guttering wildly, casting long, cavorting shadows between the graves. Like someone's walking past him, Jem told the superintendent, scratching at the soot stains on his cuffs. Only there ain't nobody there. The superintendent, a man who had long ago accepted that Highgate's payroll included both the living and the otherwise, merely sighed. Just trim the wicks and carry on. But the problem, if one could call it that, only grew. Mourners began reporting strange sights along the gaslit paths. Figures moving just beyond the circle of light. Their shapes indistinct, but their footsteps unsettlingly crisp. A widow swore she saw her late husband pacing beneath a lamp, his face turned hungrily toward the flame. A watchman chased what he thought was a trespasser, only to watch the shadowy form dissolve as it passed through a lit archway. Most alarmingly, the gas lamps began failing in peculiar patterns. A light would go out, then its neighbor 50 yards away would flare twice as bright. Then the next, and the next in a sequence that suggested movement. A very purposeful, very unnatural movement. Dr. Erasmus Pettibone, noted paranormal investigator and occasional contributor to Goodnight, the London Journal of Metaphysical Studies, took an immediate interest. Armed with a butterfly net, a flask of brandy, and a theory about luminous ectoplasmic residue, he set up watch along the cemetery's main thoroughfare. What he observed would later be published under the title, On the Phototropic Tendencies of Postmortem Entities. A study in spectral migration, much to the amusement of his academic rivals. The dead, Pettibone declared to a packed meeting of the Royal Society, are drawn to the gaslights like moths. Or perhaps more accurately, like Londoners to a public house. The reason, he posited, was both simple and unnerving. Spirits, being creatures of energy and memory, found in the gas lamps something eerily familiar, the warm glow of hearths they'd gathered around in life, the candlelit sick rooms where they'd breathed their last, the streetlights that had guided them home after evenings at the theater. The lamps weren't just illuminating the cemetery, they were calling to its residents. And the residents, in turn, were following the light. This explained why sightings increased along the best-lit paths, why shadows clustered around the lampposts on foggy nights, and most disturbingly, why the lamps near the cemetery gates burned brightest of all, as if something were trying to find its way out. The superintendent, upon reading Pettibone's findings, took immediate action. He ordered half the lamps extinguished, leaving only enough light for safety's sake. The dead, after all, had all of eternity to wonder. They could afford to move at a more leisurely pace. For a time, the plan worked. The odd sightings dwindled. The gas bills returned to reasonable levels. Then came the night Jem Hawkins reported something new. Tracks in the frost leading from a freshly extinguished lamp straight to the cemetery's eastern gate. Not footprints exactly. More like smudges, as if something had dragged itself across the frozen grass. The next evening, Mrs. Edith Harrow found a single black rose lying atop her shop's doorstep. Its stem was cold to the touch, its petals damp with what might have been dew or might have been something else entirely. And down the street, the new gas lamp outside the pawnbroker's flickered wildly for hours, though no one had lit it. Progress, as it turned out, worked both ways. The living had brought light to the land of the dead. Now the dead were returning the favor. Chapter 7. The Etiquette of Ignoring the Dead. The problem with ghosts. And let us be perfectly frank. There are many problems with ghosts. is that they so rarely understand when they are not wanted. This is particularly true of those unfortunate specters one accidentally invites home by committing the egregious social faux pas of saying goodnight in a Victorian cemetery. Once attached, these lingering souls display all the graceless persistence of a bad cold or an unwanted suitor, trailing after their living companions with a combination of melancholy and poor timing that would try the patience of a saint. Which is why, dear reader, you must learn the delicate art of pretending they do not exist. Take, for example, the case of Mr. Horace Finch, a man of impeccable breeding and regrettable superstitions, who found himself haunted by no less than 3 spirits after foolishly bidding his deceased aunt good night at her graveside. The first, a gaunt fellow in a moth-eaten waistcoat, took to appearing in Finch's parlor every evening at 8:30, sighing dramatically over the brandy decanter. The second, a woman in a water-stained ball gown, developed the irritating habit of sobbing in his linen closet. The third, a child with a penchant for hiding Finch's slippers inside the walls, was perhaps the most vexing of all. Finch's first instinct was to scream. This, while understandable, only encouraged him. His second was to flee to a hotel, but the spirits simply followed, much to the consternation of the maids. By the time he consulted Mrs. Winthrop's Guide to Modern Manners, 1857 edition, with supplemental chapter on phantasmagoric intrusions, the damage was done. He had acknowledged them, and in the world of the dead, acknowledgment is an open invitation to stay for tea. Which brings us to the first and most important rule: do not react. When you feel the telltale chill of spectral breath upon your neck while brushing your teeth, do not startle. When the curtains billow in a room with closed windows, feign fascination with your newspaper. Should your reflection in the mirror suddenly acquire extra faces, calmly excuse yourself to check on the roast. A ghost would rather be ignored than dismissed, for being ignored suggests they might still make an impression with greater effort, whereas dismissal is frightfully final. Finch, to his credit, mastered this technique with the precision of a diplomat. He took to whistling tunelessly whenever the waistcoated ghost materialized in his armchair. When the weeping woman's moans echoed from the cupboard, he would remark to no one in particular that the wind sounded peculiar tonight. As for the child, he simply bought more slippers and resigned himself to a life of cold floors. The second rule: never, under any circumstances, offer assistance. Ghosts are, by nature, creatures of unfinished business, and they will seize upon even the most casual offer of help as a binding contract. A simple "can I get you anything?" may result in a decades-long quest to locate a missing pocket watch or avenge a forgotten slight. Finch learned this the hard way, when he absent-mindedly asked if the weeping woman needed a handkerchief. The resulting flood of ectoplasmic tears ruined his wallpaper, and left him obligated to track down her long-lost betrothal ring, which had, as it turned out, been swallowed by a particularly disagreeable parrot in 1823. Instead, cultivate an air of pleasant distraction. Should a spirit attempt to unburden itself, respond with cheerful non-sequiturs. "How odd I seem to have misplaced my pen," works wonders, as does "I do believe it might rain." With practice, you can sustain entire conversations consisting of nothing but observations about the weather, a skill that serves equally well with ghosts and tedious dinner guests. The third and most vital rule: maintain plausible deniability. That flickering lamp, a draft, the whispering in the walls, mice, the portrait of your great-grandfather that now weeps black tears. Surely a trick of the light. Victorian society survived as long as it did by collectively agreeing not to notice the obvious, and this principle applies doubly to the supernatural. If pressed, blame the gasworks. If cornered, develop a sudden fascination with spiritualism, but only as an academic interest, mind you. Nothing says I did not invite you to haunt me like a bookshelf full of unread volumes on ectoplasmic phenomena. After 6 months of disciplined indifference, Finch's ghosts grew disheartened. The waistcoated gentleman took to appearing only during Finch's weekly bath, an arrangement uncomfortable for all parties. The weeping woman, finding no satisfaction in his polite disinterest, eventually drifted into the neighbor's house, where she was promptly adopted by a spinster who appreciated her dramatic flair. The child, deprived of any reaction to its pranks, stole a footman's pocket watch instead and vanished into the night. By the time Finch passed away peacefully in his sleep at the ripe old age of 72, he had become something of an authority on spectral etiquette. His final words, appropriately enough, were "Good morning," a safe, daylight-friendly alternative that crucially contains no invitation to linger. And if his own ghost now haunts Highgate Cemetery, politely ignoring the living while pretending not to notice the other spirits, well, some lessons are too valuable to leave behind. After all, in death as in life, good manners are the difference between being an invisible guest and an unwanted pest. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I hear the wind picking up. Or possibly Aunt Margaret. One mustn't jump to conclusions. Chapter 8. Cryptic Consequences. When the dead take invitations literally, the Victorians, for all their obsession with propriety, never seemed to grasp that the dead lack nuance. Where a living dinner guest might understand that you simply must visit sometime, is mere politeness. A spirit will arrive at midnight with its best cutlery and expectations of a 7-course meal. This unfortunate literalism reached its peak during what historians now call the Great Cemetery Hospitality Crisis of 1873, when half of London's bereaved suddenly found their parlours overrun with uninvited, but technically welcomed, spectral guests. The trouble began, as it so often did, with the best intentions. Miss Elspeth Wainwright, a spinster of impeccable breeding and questionable judgment, made the fatal mistake of telling her late mother's headstone, "I do wish you'd come for tea, it's been ages." This was, by all accounts, an empty pleasantry, the sort of thing one says while arranging chrysanthemums in a vase. But when Miss Wainwright returned home that evening, she found her mother's ghost sitting primly in the best armchair, tapping a translucent pocket watch and complaining about the lack of decent biscuits in the afterlife. Worse yet, the ghost had brought friends. By week's end, Miss Wainwright's modest townhouse had become something of a spectral salon. A great uncle, no one remembered inviting, perched on the mantelpiece, complaining about draughts. 3 deceased cousins played an interminable game of whist in the corner. A particularly tedious vicar, dead since 1824, had taken over the tea service and was lecturing anyone who would listen and several who wouldn't on the moral decay of modern hymnody. "I only said tea," Miss Wainwright protested weakly to her mother's ghost. "And we only came," the ghost replied, helping herself to another imaginary crumpet. News of Miss Wainwright's predicament spread through London's spiritual circles with alarming speed. Soon reports poured in from every parish of similar incidents. A haberdasher in Cheapside found his shop overrun with ghostly milliners critiquing his hat blocks. A schoolmaster awoke to find his classroom full of deceased alumni, still waiting to be excused. Most troubling of all, the Chelsea Physic Garden reported an infestation of spectral botanists arguing violently about fern classification. The church convened an emergency meeting. The Society for Psychical Research published pamphlets. Even Queen Victoria herself, no stranger to prolonged mourning, was said to have remarked, "One does miss Alba dreadfully, but one does draw the line at sharing one's bath." The solution, when it came, was both simple and brutal. A special amendment was added to U.S. Gentleman's Guide to Proper Comportment in Graveyards and Other Places of Interment, 1874 edition. Under no circumstances should any phrase implying invitation, welcome, or future social engagement be directed at memorials, headstones, or suspiciously cold patches of air. Should one accidentally extend such an invitation, immediate retraction must be made using the following precise wording. I rescind all hospitality and revoke any implied welcome, thou and in perpetuity." Miss Wainwright, upon hearing of this development, burst into tears of relief. That evening, she gathered her uninvited guests in the parlor and performed the ritual with such vigor that she toppled into the potted fern. The ghosts, miffed but bound by etiquette, departed in a huff, though not before her mother's ghost left a scathing review of the tea service in the family Bible. For a time, the crisis abated. But as with all good Victorian solutions, it created fresh complications. The sudden eviction of so many spirits led to overcrowding in cemeteries, where the dead now gathered in sulky clusters, comparing notes on poor treatment. Highgate's watchmen reported an increase in spectral loitering, with particularly disgruntled ghosts blocking pathways and sighing loudly at passers-by. Worst of all were the invitations that couldn't be taken back, the lifelong promises, the deathbed vows, the "I'll love you beyond the grave" declarations made by overwrought poets and regretful spouses. These bound the living and dead with unbreakable ties, resulting in some of the most awkward domestic arrangements in school history. Take the case of Mr. and Mrs. Arbuthnot, who discovered that "till death do us part" had been amended to, and possibly slightly beyond, when Mr. Arbuthnot's ghost continued to attend every family dinner, critique the roast, and insist on reading the newspaper aloud despite being transparent. After 12 years of this, Mrs. Arbuthnot took to serving meals in complete silence, occasionally glaring at the empty chair where her husband's ghost pretended not to notice her irritation. Or consider poor Reverend Pike, who in a moment of pastoral enthusiasm told his entire congregation, "We shall all meet again in the next life," only to find his rectory perpetually full of deceased parishioners, demanding he make good on the promise immediately. The moral, if one must be extracted from this peculiar chapter of history, is this: the Victorians may have invented modern mourning, but they never quite mastered its consequences. In teaching the living how to grieve, they accidentally taught the dead how to overstay their welcome. And if you listen very carefully on quiet evenings, in certain London neighborhoods, you can still hear the faint sound of spectral guests complaining that the tea has gone cold. Chapter 9. The Ballad of the Overly Friendly Undertaker. Mortimer P. Gladwell believed in treating the dead like honored guests at a dinner party. Just because they've stopped breathing doesn't mean they've stopped being somebody, he'd often tell his apprentices while straightening a cravat on a week-old corpse. This philosophy served him well through 30 years of undertaking, until the autumn of 1882, when his professional courtesy was returned in ways no living mortician should experience. It began with simple greetings. "Good morning, Mr. Pembroke," he'd chirp while adjusting the late banker's collar. "Lovely weather we're having, Mrs. Whitby," he'd remark to the grocer's wife as he stitched her mouth into a peaceful smile. Most undertakers maintained respectful silence, but Gladwell considered this dreadfully impolite. "They may not answer," he'd say, "but that's no excuse for poor manners." Then came the morning Gladwell swore he heard Mrs. Whitby sigh. At first he blamed the embalming fluids. Perhaps some peculiar chemical reaction had produced the sound. But when old Admiral Crawford's corpse replied, "And to you after Gladwell's customary pleasant dreams," even the mortician's legendary composure cracked. He dropped his trocar, splattering arterial fluid across his best waistcoat, and backed slowly out of the preparation room. The corpses, it seemed, had decided to be polite in return. Gladwell might have weathered this development, were it not for his other quirk. He hated funerals. All that weeping and carrying on, he'd mutter. The dead deserve better. Instead, he developed a peculiar ritual. Each evening he'd share a quiet drink with that day's guest, regaling them with neighborhood gossip as if they were old friends catching up over port. He found it helped his stitching hands stay steady. This proved disastrous when the dead started participating in the conversations. Young Timothy Farrows, tragically drowned in the Thames, began offering surprisingly insightful commentary on local cricket matches. Miss Eugenia Poole, dead of heartbreak at 23, tearfully corrected Gladwell's retelling of her own romantic misfortunes. Worst of all was the case of Professor Alistair Quimby, whose corpse not only debated Gladwell's choice of embalming techniques, but suggested several improvements to the drainage system. The breaking point came during the viewing for Lady Beatrice Hollingsworth. As Gladwell adjusted her lace collar, the noblewoman's corpse opened its eyes, actual eyes, not the glass ones he'd carefully inserted, and said, "Your fingers are cold, Mr. Gladwell." Then she sat up in her coffin and asked for tea. What followed was perhaps the most decorous panic in funeral home history. Gladwell, ever the professional, managed to bow before screaming. Lady Beatrice, equally proper, waited for him to finish before repeating her request. By the time Gladwell had composed himself enough to put the kettle on, 3 other corpses had wandered into the parlor, looking for biscuits. The situation escalated quickly. Soon, Gladwell's establishment had become something between a salon and a séance, with corpses arriving not just for burial, but for conversation. The recently deceased would walk themselves in, demanding to know why their favorite armchair had been moved. Long-buried clients dug themselves up to complain about the quality of their headstone. Gladwell, trapped by his own manners, found himself hosting what could only be described as the world's most macabre tea party. The Bishop of London eventually intervened after receiving reports of corpses taking Sunday strolls through Highgate. "You've made them too comfortable," he accused Gladwell. "Death is meant to be a solemn affair, not whatever this is." Gladwell, now serving scones to a gathering of 17th-century plague victims who had heard about the festivities, could only nod wearily. "I may have overdone the hospitality," he admitted. The solution arrived via an unlikely source, Gladwell's newest apprentice, a practical young woman named Matilda, who had no patience for supernatural nonsense. "You're treating them like guests," she pointed out. "They're supposed to be customers." With brutal efficiency, she began presenting the corpses with itemized bills for their post-mortem care. The dead, it turned out, were as scandalized by Victorian funeral costs as the living. Within a week, Gladwell's establishment returned to normal, if one could call stacks of silent corpses normal. The dead, having been reminded of the cruel economics of mortality, resumed their traditional quietude. Gladwell, though relieved, couldn't help feeling slightly hurt when his evening greetings went unanswered once more. Though if you visit certain cemeteries at twilight, you might just spot a well-dressed corpse or two, raising a spectral cup in salute when they think no one's looking. And somewhere beneath Highgate, there's rumored to be a very particular tea set that occasionally rattles on its own, as if waiting for a host who never comes. Chapter 10. Séances, Social Blunders. The Victorian drawing room séance was, at its core, an elaborate exercise in poor boundaries. What began as earnest attempts to contact departed loved ones quickly devolved into something resembling a particularly morbid parlor game, complete with unwritten rules and spectacular opportunities for social embarrassment. High society hostesses competed to secure the most fashionable mediums, while guests debated whether it was worse to be caught faking spiritual contact or to actually receive it. Mrs. Genevieve Thistlethwaite of Mayfair considered herself an authority on the matter. Her weekly spirit circles were legendary, though not necessarily for the reasons she intended. Where other hostesses might content themselves with simple table rappings or the occasional floating trumpet, Mrs. Thistlethwaite insisted on full conversations with the deceased, a decision that proved disastrous when her late Uncle Reginald used the opportunity to air decades-old family grievances in front of the Duke of Wellington's ghost. "Your scones were always dry, Genevieve," the spectral voice boomed through the medium's mouth, one Tuesday evening, while 20 of London's elite sat in horrified fascination. "And your sister stole my pocket watch in 1827. The incident might have been forgotten were it not for the unfortunate fact that the Duke, who had been successfully ignoring the Thistlethwaite family for nearly a century in the afterlife, took immediate interest in the pocket watch allegation. What followed was an impromptu post-mortem trial conducted via a Ouija board, culminating in the revelation that 3 separate spirits had claims on the timepiece, none of them legitimate. This sort of spiritual crosstalk became increasingly common as séances grew more popular. The dead, it seemed, were as prone to conversational tangents as the living, only with fewer social filters and significantly more knowledge of embarrassing family secrets. A simple request to contact Great-Aunt Millicent might summon 7 quarrelsome ancestors, a confused medieval peasant who thought the Séance was Judgment Day, and at least one spirit who just wanted to complain about the cold. Professional mediums quickly developed strategies to mitigate these interactions. Madame Zora, London's most sought-after spiritualist, kept index cards on prominent ghosts' preferences. Lord Weatherby's spectre demanded Earl Grey tea be placed on the séance table. The ghost of opera singer Isabella Bellini required someone to hum her favorite aria. Less scrupulous operators simply invented pleasant messages from the beyond, though this carried its own risks, as demonstrated when medium Horace Pettigrew's fictional happy grandmother was interrupted by the actual deceased, who called him a lying snake in front of 12 paying customers. The real trouble began when the dead started initiating contact unprompted. Dr. Ephraim Holloway, noted skeptic and part-time mycologist, discovered this when his breakfast table began spelling out messages in toast crumbs. His initial excitement at apparent automatic toasting turned to alarm when the bread fragments formed increasingly aggressive critiques of his research papers. By the time an entire loaf arranged itself into the words, "Your taxonomy is lazy," Holloway had taken to eating only porridge. Similar reports poured in across the city. A dowager countess found her late husband's ghost, using her prized china cabinet to stage shadow puppet recreations of their worst marital art. The British Museum's Egyptian wing became unusable after several mummies began correcting tour guides through the display cases. Most troublingly, the dead developed a particular fondness for interrupting live theater. Shakespeare performances now regularly featured spectral understudies who disagreed with the director's choices. The Church of England's Committee on Spectral Nuisances convened an emergency meeting. After 6 hours of debate, interrupted twice by the ghost of a Reformation-era bishop heckling the proceedings, they issued new guidelines for spiritual communication. 1. All séances must be by invitation only, for both the living and dead participants. 2. Spirits were limited to 5 minutes of uninterrupted speaking time. 3. No discussing wills, inheritances, or long-buried scandals. 4. Absolutely no possession of household pets to get around these rules. Enforcement proved tricky. The dead, having little else to occupy their time, became adept at finding loopholes. When barred from formal séances, they took to communicating through increasingly bizarre channels, haunting chess games, rearranging children's alphabet blocks, and in one memorable case using a shipment of Italian marbles to spell out obscenities across a merchant's warehouse floor. Mrs. Thistlethwaite, perhaps predictably, became the epicenter of this new spiritual unrest. Her once exclusive séances had devolved into something resembling a spectral boarding house, with ghosts lining up to air grievances. The final straw came when a particularly persistent spirit began using her best linens to craft elaborate shadow puppets illustrating her husband's infidelities, all while dinner guests looked on. "We must establish boundaries," she declared at her final spirit circle, to audible groans from both living and dead attendees. The afterlife is not an excuse for poor manners. For a time, this worked. The dead, somewhat abashed, retreated to more traditional haunting hours. Séances became quieter affairs, limited to brief, polite exchanges. The toast stopped spelling out insults. But if you listen very carefully during London's quiet moments, between the chime of midnight and the creak of old floorboards, you can still hear the faint echoes of unfinished conversations. The dead, it seems, are still waiting for their turn to speak. And given eternity to practice, they're becoming increasingly creative about getting our attention. Chapter 11. The Fashion of Fear. Dressing for a haunting? The Victorians understood, in a way modern society has largely forgotten, that clothing was never merely fabric, it was a language. A widow's crape veils spoke volumes about her grief. A gentleman's pocket watch chain whispered of his standing. And as it turned out, one's choice of cemetery attire practically shouted invitations to the spirit world, whether one intended to or not. This sartorial haunting phenomenon was first properly documented by Dr. Algernon Creevey, whose 1871 treatise En Postmortem Attraction. The sympathetic principles of mourning attire and spectral manifestation caused quite a stir among both academic circles and the more fashionable set of London's ghost enthusiasts. Through meticulous experimentation, and no small amount of personal peril, Creevey established that spirits reacted to human clothing with the same discernment as a society matron evaluating debutantes at a ball. The deceased, Creevey wrote, appear particularly drawn to garments that mirror their own era of passing. A ghost from the Regency period will invariably gravitate toward a visitor in high-waisted muslin, while a more recently departed spirit might be intrigued by the bustle of a modern morning gown. This explained why certain cemetery visitors reported spectral encounters while others walked undisturbed. The dead weren't choosing victims at random. They were following the fashion. The implications were immediate and unsettling. Suddenly, every black-draped widow and top-hatted gentleman strolling through Highgate became a potential beacon for supernatural attention. Worse still, the wealthier one's mourning attire. The more jet beads, the more expensive the black dye, the stronger the pull seemed to be. Lady Eleanor Westmore discovered this the hard way when she wore her French-made mourning ensemble, complete with 16 yards of imported crepe and a hat adorned with genuine ostrich plumes, to visit her husband's grave at twilight. She had barely reached the family plot when she found herself surrounded by no fewer than 7 spectral figures, all deceased Westmore ancestors, critiquing her choices. "That lace is entirely inappropriate for evening," clucked her great-aunt's ghost, eyeing the trim on Eleanor's sleeves. "We wore proper bombazine in my day." Her husband's ghost, meanwhile, seemed more concerned with the cost. "Do you have any idea what the dead would do with that much crepe?" he moaned, watching as the expensive fabric billowed dramatically in the evening breeze. "We're buried in simple shrouds, Eleanor." By the time Eleanor fled the cemetery, her hat had been rearranged 3 times by fussy phantom hands. Her gloves had mysteriously vanished. Spirits disapproved of the pearl buttons, and she'd received detailed notes on improving her mourning wardrobe from generations of Westmore women. The experience left her so shaken that she took to wearing a housemaid's plain black shawl for subsequent visits, a choice that rendered her nearly invisible to her fashion-conscious ancestors. Creevey's research took a darker turn when he investigated cases where excessive mourning attire didn't just attract spirits, but trapped them. The infamous case of Reginald Ashworth's haunted frock coat demonstrated how clothing could become a prison for the dead. Ashworth, a dandy of the First Order, had been buried in his favorite coat, an extravagant creation with 23 hand-stitched buttonholes and lapels, wide enough to sail small craft upon. When his ghost began appearing throughout London, it was always in the same pose, arms outstretched as if frozen mid-spin, the coat's exaggerated tails flaring dramatically behind him. Mediums who attempted to communicate with Ashworth received only fragmented responses about proper drape and fall of fabric. Psychical researchers eventually concluded that the coat's extreme tailoring had somehow anchored Ashworth's spirit to its specific shape, leaving him doomed to eternally reenact his final and apparently very stylish moment. By the 1880s, a whole industry had sprung up around spectral fashion avoidance. Quiet dressers offered discreet consultations for those wishing to visit grave sites without attracting unwanted attention. Mediums developed color-coded systems to indicate which eras of clothing were safest, in which cemeteries. Highgate's Georgian section, for instance, was notoriously hostile to crinolines. The more pragmatic simply took to wearing brown, a color most spirits seemed to find dreadfully boring. Ironically, the solution to this sartorial haunting came from the most unlikely of sources: the dead themselves. As Victorian fashion grew increasingly elaborate, the spirits, many of whom had died in simpler times, began expressing outright disapproval of the new trends. The ghost of a Puritan minister took to haunting Bond Street tailors, ripping lace cuffs off displays. A deceased modiste from the 1820s haunted a Mayfair townhouse for weeks, weeping over the sight of a bustle. By the century's end, a curious equilibrium had been reached. The living toned down their mourning excesses just enough to avoid constant spectral commentary, while the dead grudgingly accepted that fashion would march on without them. Though if you visit certain cemeteries at dusk, you might still spot a particularly well-dressed ghost lingering near the gates, eyeing visitors' outfits with a critical gaze. And should you feel an unexplained chill run down your spine, check your hemlines. Dead, it seems, still have opinions. Chapter 12. The Great Cemetery Reform Movement. By the mid-19th century, London's burial grounds had reached a state of crisis that even the most oblivious city officials could no longer ignore. Churchyards meant to hold a few hundred souls now groaned beneath thousands, with graves stacked upon graves until the earth threatened to spit its contents back onto the streets. The dead, it seemed, were quite literally pushing up daisies, and occasionally fingers, femurs, and the odd gold, too. The situation reached its breaking point during the particularly wet summer of 1848, when heavy rains caused the walls of St. Clement's churchyard to bulge ominously before finally giving way, depositing several very surprised corpses into the basement of a nearby hat shop. The milliner, a Mr. Phineas Wimple, emerged from this experience with both a newfound respect for mortality and an unfortunately haunted collection of bonnets. This incident finally spurred Parliament into action, forming the Metropolitan Interment Commission with one solemn duty: to bury the dead before they buried the living. Thus began the Great Cemetery Reform Movement, an ambitious project to relocate London's departed to spacious new garden cemeteries on the city's outskirts. Highgate, Kensal Green, and Nunhead were among the first of these grand necropolises, designed with all the care of royal parks, but with significantly more permanent residents. What the Commission hadn't accounted for, however, was that the dead could be remarkably particular about real estate. The first signs of spectral discontent appeared when workers attempted to relocate remains from the overcrowded St. Bride's churchyard to the shiny new Kensal Green. No sooner had the first bones been carefully transferred than reports began pouring in of apparitions appearing at both sites simultaneously, the same ghosts somehow occupying their original and new resting places at once. The phenomenon, which Dr. Erasmus Pettibone dubbed Postmortem bilocation, created all manner of bureaucratic headaches. Did one leave flowers at the original grave or the new one? Which location required the customary good morning nod to avoid offense? Most troublingly, how did one calculate burial fees when a single individual now occupied 2 plots? The problem grew more complex as entire neighborhoods were exhumed. Spirits accustomed to familiar surroundings suddenly found themselves in unfamiliar territory, and they reacted with all the grace of aristocracy forced to summer outside Brighton. Ghosts clustered at cemetery gates, comparing notes on their new accommodations. The more vocal dead took to haunting surveyors' offices, whispering complaints about poor drainage or insufficiently Gothic architecture into the ears of sleeping clerks. In one particularly memorable incident, the relocated spirit of a notoriously grumpy pastry chef haunted an entire block of Baker Street, manifesting only to critique the quality of local baked goods before vanishing with a dramatic huff. When confronted by a medium about why he'd abandoned his perfectly comfortable new grave at Highgate, the chef's ghost replied, "The soil's too damp for proper croissants," and refused to elaborate further. The Commission's solution: to move entire churchyards intact, soil and all, only created fresh problems. Now the dead had their familiar dirt, but found themselves surrounded by strangers. The resulting spectral squabbles would have been amusing if they weren't so disruptive. The ghost of an 18th-century fishmonger took to bickering with a Renaissance-era poet over who had seniority in their new shared space. A group of plague victims formed an impromptu neighborhood watch, suspicious of all newcomers. Worse still were the dead who refused to move at all. Stubborn spirits clung to their original plots, even as buildings rose around them, becoming increasingly cantankerous as their peace was disturbed by living neighbors. The ghost of Lady Hortense Pembroke famously haunted a newly built public house for 3 years, disapprovingly watching patrons through a wall that had once been her family crypt. When asked by a medium why she didn't simply relocate to her lovely new grave at Nunhead, she sniffed, "I didn't spend 60 years cultivating the perfect haunting spot to abandon it for some developer's notion of fashionable eternity." By 1860, an uneasy compromise had been reached. The living got their urban reforms, and the dead were largely left to arrange themselves as they saw fit. The new cemeteries developed distinct personalities: Highgate for the dramatic haunters, Kensal Green for the social dead, Nunhead for those who preferred quiet, while certain stubborn spirits simply became part of London's living landscape, as permanent as the cobblestones. Though if you walk certain streets at twilight, you might still hear the faint sounds of spectral tenants arguing over property lines. And in the basement of that hat shop on Clement Lane, the bonnets still occasionally twitch on their stands, as if disturbed by some unseen customer browsing wares that will never quite suit them. Chapter 13. The Silent Treatment. A Survival Guide. The Victorians, having created the problem of overly sociable spirits through their cemetery reforms and séance fashions, naturally produced an entire genre of literature dedicated to avoiding unwanted ghostly interactions. Page Gentleman's Guide to Unobtrusive Graveyard Navigation, 1857, and A.J. Lady's Primer on Spectral Evasion, 1862, became essential reading for anyone who valued both their sanity and their Sunday stroll. These manuals offered exhaustive, and often contradictory, advice on traversing burial grounds without becoming entangled in conversations with the deceased. The first and most universal rule was simple: maintain absolute silence. This proved more challenging than anticipated, as Victorian clothing was notoriously noisy. Crinolines rustled like a forest in a gale. Starched collars creaked like ship timbers. Even the most cautious gentleman might find his pocket watch chiming at inopportune moments, or his walking stick tapping rhythmically against stones in a manner that spirits often mistook for Morse code invitations. Mrs. Arabella Wimple, no relation to the bonnet-traumatized milliner, devoted 3 chapters of her seminal work Postmortem, Etiquette, to footwear selection. "Kit leather soles," she wrote, though fashionable, produce a telltale squeak that carries remarkably well in the spirit world. She recommended felt-soled slippers for ladies, and for gentlemen the application of mutton fat to boot heels, a solution that worked admirably for stealth, but rendered the wearer profoundly unpopular in drawing rooms. Breathing, too, became a fraught activity. Dr. Theophilus Protzke's respiratory considerations for the cemetery visitor, 1865, argued that the dead were particularly attuned to the living's exhalations, interpreting them as conversational openings. He advised shallow, nasal breathing while passing gravesides, a technique that left many practitioners lightheaded and more susceptible to fainting, which, as it turned out, attracted even more spectral attention. The matter of eye contact sparked furious debate among experts. Reverend Horace Wintermuth insisted that meeting a ghost's gaze was tantamount to shaking its hand, while Madame Zelda of Chelsea claimed that avoiding eye contact marked one as rude and therefore more interesting to mischievous spirits. The compromise, developed through unfortunate trial and error, was to maintain a polite but unfocused stare approximately 2 feet above any suspected apparition's head, a technique that gave visitors the appearance of being terribly concerned with cemetery tree maintenance. Carrying objects presented another minefield. Flowers were acceptable but risky, Roses might attract romantic spirits, while lilies could summon grieving mothers. Umbrellas were controversial. Some ghosts interpreted them as shelter offers, others as potential weapons. The safest option, according to Uwe Paul Moll, Phantom Almanac, was to carry a small, uninteresting rock in one's pocket, as the dead find geology exceptionally tedious. Timing one's visit required similar precision. Dawn and dusk were universally acknowledged as thin times when the veil between worlds grew permeable. Midday was safer but carried the risk of encountering living mourners, whose emotional outbursts might stir nearby spirits. Moonlight was to be avoided entirely unless one wished to participate in what Time's ghost correspondent delicately termed nocturnal assemblies. Young Percival Throckmorton's Practical Exercises for the Reluctant Necrotourist, 1871, took a more active approach, recommending that readers prepare for cemetery visits by practicing what he called the art of being profoundly boring. His suggested exercises included reciting multiplication tables under one's breath, mentally cataloging one's own minor ailments, and imagining detailed descriptions of gray paint drying. The theory held that ghosts, like living people, would flee from dull company. These methods were put to the test during the infamous Great Highgate Polite Panic of 1873, when a sudden surge in spectral sociability coincided with a particularly popular funeral. Dozens of well-meaning visitors, all following different guidebook advice, created a perfect storm of supernatural confusion. One contingent breathed shallowly through their noses, while another hummed dull hymns. A group of ladies shuffled in felt slippers, while their husbands clutched rocks and stared fixedly at tree branches. The resulting cacophony of half-suppressed sneezes, rustling fabric, and monotonous number recitation stirred every ghost within a mile radius. Witnesses reported seeing spirits emerging from graves, with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright offense. The ghost of a celebrated orator famously spent 40 minutes trying to engage various visitors in conversation, growing increasingly frustrated as they either stared past his head or answered in monotone multiplication facts. The incident culminated when Lady Fitzwilliam's corset stays snapped from the effort of restrained breathing, producing a sound like a gunshot that startled both living and dead alike into finally screaming, a catharsis that, oddly enough, seemed to satisfy all parties. In the aftermath, a new approach gained popularity: selective acknowledgement. This method involved treating ghosts much like one might treat eccentric relatives at a garden party. A polite nod if eye contact occurred, perhaps a vague murmur about the weather, but no engagement that might encourage prolonged interaction. The dead, it turned out, appreciated this approach far more than being ignored entirely or subjected to amateur exorcisms. Modern visitors to London's great cemeteries might still spot the occasional Victorian ghost lingering near popular paths, watching the living with quiet amusement. And if you listen very carefully on still afternoons, you might just hear the faintest whisper of advice from beyond. For heaven's sake, breathe normally. We can hold our silence if you can hold your composure. Though if you do encounter Lady Fitzwilliam's ghost, it's still considered polite to compliment her on that spectacular corset failure. Some moments, it seems, transcend even death's propriety. Chapter 14. The Peculiar Case of the Yawning Grave. In the northeast corner of Highgate Cemetery, where the ivy grew particularly thick and the angles between graves seemed just slightly wrong, there existed a burial plot that had developed an unsettling habit. It yawned back at visitors. The phenomenon was first noted by the gravedigger Samuel Higgs, a man not given to flights of fancy, but who swore that after he absent-mindedly bid plot 29B good evening, following a long day's work, the earth itself had exhaled in response. A great shuddering sigh that sent fallen leaves skittering and made the gas lamps gutter wildly. Higgs, being a practical sort, assumed it was wind through a hollow in the ground and thought little of it until the new widow Pembroke came weeping to her husband's grave the next evening and reported the same occurrence. I told him good night. She told the cemetery superintendent with trembling lips, and the ground told it back to me. By week's end, half of London's spiritualists had descended upon Plot 29B like vultures to carrion. Mediums held séances at its borders, their hands pressed to soil that seemed unnaturally warm. Paranormal investigators set up equipment that measured nothing in particular, but made satisfying clicking noises. Even Dr. Erasmus Pettibone made an appearance, declaring the grave either a remarkable geological anomaly or the world's most somnolent ghost before retiring to the pub to contemplate both possibilities over a pint. The grave's inhabitant, according to cemetery records, was one Algernon Fairweather, a clerk of no particular importance who had died quietly in his sleep at the respectable age of 72. His stone bore no remarkable epitaph, his plot no special decoration. Yet now, every evening between 9 and 10 o'clock, visitors who paused to bid the spot good night would be met with that same tired exhalation, as if the earth itself were a weary sleeper turning over in bed. Theories abounded. The more scientifically inclined suggested underground air currents, or the settling of an improperly sealed coffin. The spiritually minded insisted Fairweather had been a somnambulist in life, and continued the habit in death. Mrs. Eugenia Holloway, she of the overly chatty corpse from Chapter 5, became convinced the grave was actually a portal to the land of Nod, and took to leaving warm milk and biscuits at its border, much to the annoyance of the cemetery's rat population. The truth, as it often does, came from an unexpected quarter. A half-deaf gardener named Mr. Tibbs, who had worked Highgate's grounds since before Fairweather's burial. Over a shared flask of suspiciously aromatic tea, he explained to the superintendent that old Algernon hadn't been quite as ordinary as records suggested. Terrible case of the yawns, that one, Tibbs recalled, scratching at his stubble. Couldn't stay awake at his own wedding, so they say, fell asleep during the baptism of all 3 children. The funeral director had to prop him up twice during the viewing when his nodding head kept knocking over the flowers. This explained everything and nothing all at once. As word spread, Plot 29B became something of a macabre attraction. Young lovers came to whisper sweet nothings and giggle at the answering sigh. Insomniacs visited in hopes of catching its contagious sleepiness. One enterprising charlatan even began selling Fairweather's miracle sleeping powders, repackaged chamomile that sold remarkably well until the constables intervened. The grave's popularity proved to be its undoing. After a particularly raucous gathering of medical students attempting to document the phenomenon with brandy and a stolen stethoscope, the yawns stopped. Whether Fairweather's ghost had finally gotten some proper rest or simply grown tired of the attention, no one could say. The ground fell silent, leaving only a slightly sunken patch of earth as evidence anything unusual had occurred at all. Though if you visit Plot 29B today on a quiet evening, and if you're very lucky, you might catch the faintest whisper of breath from below. Not a proper yawn, perhaps, but the ghost of one. A reminder that even in death, some habits die harder than others. And if you're very wise, you'll take the hint and keep your good nights to yourself. Some conversations, after all, are better left unfinished. Chapter 15. Postmortem Pen Pals. The Victorian postal service was a marvel of modern efficiency, delivering letters across the empire with clockwork precision. It stood to reason, then, that some particularly enterprising mourners would attempt to extend this service beyond the grave, with decidedly mixed results. The practice began innocently enough with simple notes left at gravesites. Dearest Edward, the roses are in bloom, or mother, I wore your pearls to the ball. These epistles of grief were never meant to be answered, much like tossing coins into a fountain. But when Mrs. Caroline Wexford of Chelsea returned to her husband's grave a week after leaving such a note, and found it replaced with a page bearing the words, "Thank you," the pears were delicious in handwriting decidedly not her own. London's spiritual community took notice. Soon, cemetery benches doubled as writing desks for the bereaved. Postal slots were installed in mausoleum walls. The more avant-garde mediums offered post-mortem correspondence services at exorbitant rates, though most simply pocketed the money and invented flowery messages from beyond. Genuine cases of apparent communication, however, followed peculiar patterns that defied easy explanation. Dr. Algernon Crivet documented 37 verified instances of responsive grave letters in his Eye Study of Epistolary Ectoplasm, 1879. The replies shared disturbing commonalities, always written in the recipient's own hand, yet containing information they couldn't possibly know. A widow received cooking advice from her mother-in-law specifying an ingredient she'd never used. A bankrupt merchant found stock tips scribbled in his deceased partner's distinctive shorthand. Most chillingly, several correspondents began receiving replies to letters they swore they'd never sent. The case of the Chatsworth family vault became particularly infamous. Young Timothy Chatsworth, in a fit of grief, had slipped childhood drawings beneath his sister's crypt door each week. The sketches always vanished by his next visit, replaced by increasingly elaborate doodles in the margins of the paper, doodles that matured in skill at an impossible rate. By the fifth exchange, the sketches showed technical mastery far beyond Timothy's abilities. By the eighth, they depicted rooms in the family home that had been renovated after his sister's death. The phenomenon took a sinister turn when correspondents began receiving unsolicited mail. Mr. Horace Pembleton awoke to find a water-stained love letter on his pillow, signed by a woman who'd drowned the year before his birth. The staff at Highgate Cemetery reported letters appearing in empty graves, addressed to people who wouldn't die for decades. The Postmaster General, upon being presented with a bundle of these preemptive condolences, all bearing future dates, took to drinking before noon. Theories abounded. Spiritualists claimed the dead were perfecting their penmanship. Physicists muttered about temporal anomalies. The more pragmatic suggested an elaborate hoax, though no one could explain how the forger had reproduced Miss Eugenia Poole's signature down to the chemical composition of her ink 3 years after her burial. The Church's solution was characteristically Victorian. They invented bureaucracy. The Office of Postmortem Correspondence was established in 1881 to regulate communications between temporal and spiritual realms. Standardized forms were introduced: deceased's full name, relationship to sender, nature of inquiry. Grieving relatives now needed triplicate copies and a clergyman's approval before slipping so much as a grocery list under a headstone. This proved disastrous. The dead, it seemed, had no patience for paperwork. Replies now came crammed into the margins of the forms themselves, growing increasingly sarcastic. "I died of scarlet fever, not querulousness," scrawled one spirit where it should have listed cause of death. Another simply wrote, "See other side," and drew an elaborate cartoon of the caseworker being haunted. The final straw came when the Archbishop of Canterbury received an impeccably calligraphed complaint about cemetery noise levels, signed by 7 centuries' worth of deceased clergymen. The office was quietly shuttered, though not before burning its files in what was later deemed an excessive quantity of holy oil. Modern visitors to London's great cemeteries can still find the occasional letter tucked beside weathered stones. The caretakers turn a blind eye. They know the dead will have their correspondence, regulations be damned. And if you look very carefully at some of the older graves, you might just spot the faintest impression of ink seeping up through the soil, like words bleeding through from the other side of the page. Though, if you do feel compelled to write, a word of advice: mind your stationery choices. The dead, it turns out, are particular about paper quality. And whatever you do, don't use red ink. That's how you get the angry letters. Chapter 16. The Architect of Afterlife, Annoyances. Sir Reginald Pembleton Smythe had never set out to become the most controversial cemetery designer of the Victorian era. His ambitions had been modest: to create burial grounds that were less depressing. Armed with an inheritance and a dangerous amount of enthusiasm, He set about revolutionizing mortuary aesthetics under the philosophy that death should be as comfortable for the deceased as it is convenient for the living. The result was Elysian Fields Memorial Park, a cemetery so pleasant, so inviting, that it fundamentally misunderstood the purpose of graveyards. Where traditional burial grounds favored imposing Gothic spires and melancholic angels, Pembleton Smythe installed gazebos. The winding paths, rather than evoking solemn contemplation, meandered like country garden trails, complete with decorative footbridges over artificial streams. The family plots were arranged in cozy cul-de-sacs, giving the impression of a postmortem neighborhood. Most catastrophically, he lined every pathway with exceptionally comfortable benches, each bearing brass plaques that read "Rest a while." The dead took this as an invitation. Within weeks of Elysian Fields' grand opening, reports surfaced of spectral figures lounging on benches, their transparent forms sinking into the cushions with audible sighs of relief. Groundskeepers found certain gravesites inexplicably tidy, as if someone had been maintaining them from the inside out. Most alarmingly, the cemetery's reflection, grotto, a charming nook Pembleton Smythe had designed for quiet mourning, became the site of an eternal ghostly tea party, with spirits materializing at all hours to clink invisible cups and complain about the living's poor men. Pembleton Smythe, at first, was delighted. "Proof of concept," he crowed to investors, waving away concerns about the grotto's increasingly rowdy spectral gatherings. His enthusiasm dimmed, however, when the dead began venturing beyond cemetery bounds. A shopkeeper on Elm Street reported his storefront being meticulously rearranged each night by the ghost of a fastidious haberdasher. The local pub developed a phantom regular who haunted the corner booth and complained about modern ale quality. Worst of all, the benches from Elysian Fields began appearing in dreams. Hundreds of Londoners reported identical visions of a particularly inviting oak bench that whispered, "Just sit," for a moment in voices suspiciously like their deceased relatives. The church's Committee on Unseemly Afterlife Activity convened an emergency session. After reviewing the case and attempting to banish a ghostly committee clerk who died mid-meeting but refused to leave, they determined Pembleton Smythe had violated the first rule of cemetery design. Graves should encourage the dead to stay put, not get ideas. Their solution was characteristically bureaucratic. A 47-page ordinance titled "Regulations Concerning Postmortem Comforts and Their Reasonable Limits" banned benches within 20 feet of graves, mandated a minimum creepiness for all statuary, and required that at least one crow be present per acre to maintain proper act. Pembleton Smythe was forced to redesign Elysian Fields, replacing the footbridges with less hospitable ditches, and installing deliberately uncomfortable wrought iron seating. The dead protested these changes with remarkable creativity. The tea party relocated to the cemetery's tool shed. Ghosts took to piling leaves into makeshift cushions wherever benches had been removed. One particularly stubborn spirit began dragging its grave dirt into neighboring churchyards, muttering about proper landscaping standards. Pembleton Smythe, thoroughly chastened, spent his final years designing deliberately dreary prisons and workhouses, structures guaranteed to discourage lingering, alive or otherwise. Though if you visit certain London parks at twilight, you might still spot the occasional spectral figure hovering near a particularly comfortable bench, looking wistfully in the direction of what might have been. And if you listen very carefully when passing Elysian Fields, you can just hear the faint sounds of discontented sighs rising from the now uncomfortable graves, and one particularly loud ghost still complaining about the benches. Chapter 17. The Midnight Mourners Club. Insomnia was something of an epidemic among London's upper crust in the autumn of 1888, not the common garden-variety sleeplessness that plagued the working classes, but a refined, almost fashionable restlessness that lent itself to dramatic sighs and poetic complaints about the weight of existence. It was only a matter of time before someone organized it into a social club. The midnight mourners began, as these things often do, with a chance encounter between two sleepless souls in Highgate Cemetery. Percival Thistlethwaite, he of the dull multiplication exercises from chapter 13, had been pacing the Egyptian Avenue when he nearly collided with Lady Clarissa Montague Baines, who was attempting to read Eye-Wuthering Heights by moonlight atop her late husband's sarcophagus. In their mutual embarrassment, they discovered a shared appreciation for the cemetery's nocturnal charms. The way the gas lamps made the ivy glow emerald. How the silence felt different when one wasn't supposed to be awake to hear it. By the month's end, their chance meeting had blossomed into a formal society. Every Thursday at 11:30, London's most elegantly exhausted would gather at the cemetery's north gate, clad in their finest morning attire, despite the spectral fashion risks outlined in Chapter 11, to wander the paths and discuss philosophy, literature, and the peculiar comforts of being awake when the rest of the world slept. They developed rituals, a moment of silence observed at the stroke of midnight, the sharing of particularly potent sleeping draught recipes, a strict ban on mentioning anything that might actually induce drowsiness. The dead at first seemed content to let them be. Perhaps the spirits appreciated the company. Perhaps they found the club's activities too dull to warrant intervention. Whatever the reason, an uneasy truce held until the night the mourners decided to liven things up with a game of spectral charades. The premise was simple enough. One member would pantomime a famous ghost story while the others guessed. Young Lord Featherington, thoroughly soused on laudanum-laced sherry, had just begun an enthusiastic interpretation of the Headless Horseman, when an actual headless figure emerged from the mists near the Circle of Lebanon. The group erupted in polite applause, assuming this was part of the act, until the figure reached down, picked up its own severed head, and asked in perfect upper-class tones, "Are you quite finished? Only you're disturbing my rest." This incident, rather than discouraging the club, only increased its popularity. Soon, every insomniac in London wanted a chance to meet Highgate's resident spirits. The meetings grew more elaborate. Picnic spreads were laid out atop graves, with careful attention to dietary restrictions both living and dead. String quartets were hired to play nocturnes for mixed audiences, and one particularly ambitious evening featured a midnight cricket match between teams of corporeal and incorporeal players that ended abruptly when the ghostly wicket-keeper dissolved into mist mid-catch. The dead's tolerance for these antics varied wildly. Some spirits, like the perpetually grumpy Colonel Thaddeus Graves, took to following members home to complain about the noise. Others, like the ghost of opera singer Isabella Bellini, she of the requested arias from Chapter 10, became regular attendees, holding impromptu performances that left living listeners weeping for reasons they couldn't quite name. A few particularly mischievous spirits began playing along with the charades, leading to increasingly surreal evenings where no one could be certain which performers were living and which were merely excellent actors in the afterlife. The club's downfall came, as these things often do, from bureaucracy rather than ghosts. The cemetery superintendent, tired of explaining strange noises to daytime visitors, implemented a strict no nocturnal gatherings policy. The church, alarmed by reports of spectral mingling, declared such activities unseemly and potentially sacrilegious. Even the dead seemed to grow weary of the constant social demands. One exhausted spirit was overheard complaining to another, "I didn't cross the veil to attend garden parties." By 1890, the Midnight Mourners had disbanded, their members scattered to more conventional insomnia cures, counting sheep, warm milk, and the occasional midnight stroll through slightly less haunted parks. Though if you pass by Highgate Cemetery on certain Thursday evenings, you might still catch the faint echo of laughter drifting through the iron gates. And if you look very closely at the Circle of Lebanon, you may just spot the shimmering outlines of a ghostly picnic in progress, with one empty space left, as always, for unexpected living guests. The dead, it seems, still keep the club's traditions alive, and they've gotten much better at charades. Chapter 18. The Linguistics of the Unseen. Language, to the Victorians, was never simply a means of communication. It was a kind of magic. Words carried weight beyond their definitions, shaped reality through their utterance, and in certain contexts could open doors best left closed. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the peculiar lexicon of the cemetery, where everyday phrases took on supernatural significance, and even the most casual farewell might be misconstrued as invitation. The problem with Goodnight, that treacherous word that had caused so much spectral bother, lay in its dual nature. By day, a harmless pleasantry. By night, in the company of the dead, it transformed into something far more perilous. A blessing. And blessings, as any ghost worth its salt knew, were binding. Dr. Lionel Thistlethwaite's Philological Survey of Postmortem Communication, 1876, devoted an entire chapter to what he termed vocative hauntings, instances where spirits appeared to have been summoned, consciously or not, through specific word choices. His research uncovered disturbing patterns. Goodnight produced the highest rate of unwanted spiritual attachment, followed closely by sweet dreams, which inexplicably attracted nightmare-afflicted specters, and the particularly disastrous sleep tight, which in 3 documented cases caused corpses to sit bolt upright in their coffins as if pulled by invisible strings. The issue, Thistlethwaite theorized, was one of literal interpretation. The dead, unburdened by metaphor, heard exactly what was said. Tell a grave to rest in peace, and its occupant might take this as a command to remain dormant. Bid it good night with the same tone one used for living household members, and suddenly you'd acquired a spectral border. This linguistic literalism explained so many of the era's haunting peculiarities. Why ghosts always appeared at the foot of beds when told, "Don't let the bedbugs bite." Why spirits took such offense at being called spooks. Why no amount of ecclesiastical intervention could remove the ghost of Professor Alastair Quimby from the university library, after some fool had told him to stay and study a while. The Victorians, being Victorians, responded to this discovery with lists. Harrow's Guide to Cemetery Conversation, 1882, included a handy chart of safe, risky, and catastrophic phrases for graveyard use. "Lovely weather we're having" was deemed acceptable, if dull. "You look well" was flagged as potentially hazardous. Complimenting a corpse's appearance could be taken as encouragement. "Do come by" sometime was printed in bold red letters with 3 warning symbols beside it. These guidelines might have solved the problem entirely were it not for regional dialects. In Yorkshire, where now then served as universal greeting, the dead took this to mean they should remain present indefinitely. Cornwall's habit of calling everyone "my lover" resulted in several awkward post-mortem attachments. The worst confusion struck Glasgow, where a well-meaning widow C.E. Efter was interpreted by her late husband's ghost as a summons to follow her into the bath. The Church's solution, to develop a special cemetery cant called lingua mortis, proved typically overcomplicated. This stilted dialect stripped English of all metaphorical language, reduced greetings to non-committal nods, and replaced farewells with a vague humming noise. While effective at preventing hauntings, it made funerals even more unbearable than usual. The final straw came when Bishop Pembleton, attempting to eulogize a beloved philanthropist in lingua mortis, was reduced to saying, "The person we are here for did many good actions. Now, they are in a different place. This is both accurate and not our problem." The congregation revolted, and the dialect was quietly abandoned. Modern visitors to Victorian cemeteries can still see traces of this linguistic anxiety. The proliferation of silence, please signs, wasn't just about respect. It was a desperate attempt to shut down conversation altogether. The trend toward shorter epitaphs reflected not just changing tastes, but a very real fear that the dead might take flowery inscriptions at face value. Though if you listen very carefully on still evenings, you might hear the ghosts themselves debating these very rules. Their voices carry the same exasperated tone as living linguists arguing over semantics and proper usage. After all, eternity is long, and nothing passes the time like a good grammatical debate. Just be careful what words you use to greet them. Good evening might be safe enough, but say what's new, and you'll be there all night listening to their answer. Chapter 19. The final word on farewells. By the close of the Victorian era, London's cemeteries had become something akin to grand, well-furnished parlors. Spaces where the living and the dead engaged in an endless, awkward dance of etiquette. The rules of engagement had been codified through trial and error, superstition and science, and no small amount of humiliating spectral encounters. But if there was one lesson the age had learned above all others, it was this: some phrases should never be spoken among tombstones after dusk. The trouble with farewells, as linguists and mediums alike had discovered, was that they implied a parting of ways. And the dead, being rather more permanent guests than one might prefer, had a tendency to take such implications personally. Take, for instance, the simple phrase, "until we meet again," a harmless sentiment among the living, a polite fiction suggesting future reunions. But to the deceased, it sounded suspiciously like a contractual obligation. The archives of the Society for Psychical Research overflowed with reports of spirits manifesting at inopportune moments, eager to fulfill their end of the bargain, appearing at breakfast, hovering outside carriage windows, even materializing mid-sermon to remind the speaker that yes, I met again, just as promised. Then there was the farewell, a word that carried far more finality than its well-meaning users intended. To bid a ghost farewell was, in essence, to declare the conversation, and by extension their lingering presence, officially over. Predictably, this did not sit well with spirits who had spent decades, if not centuries, perfecting the art of loitering in the mortal realm. The result was often a kind of supernatural stubbornness, where the more emphatically one tried to dismiss a spirit, the more determinedly it clung. And of course there was Goodnight, that treacherous, honeyed word, soft as candlelight and twice as dangerous. It was, after all, a blessing of rest, a wish for peaceful darkness. And what were ghosts, if not creatures already steeped in both? The Victorians, ever resourceful, developed workarounds. Good evening was deemed acceptable until midnight, at which point it became perilously close to Goodnight. Until tomorrow was permitted only if one fully intended to return the following day. Lying to the dead was considered both rude and legally precarious after the 1874 case of Wentworth, the persistent ghost of Aunt Ag. The safest option, of course, was to say nothing at all, but this presented its own challenges, as ignoring the dead was tantamount to inviting them to make their presence unignorable. The solution, as with most Victorian problems, was bureaucracy. The Ministry of Postmortem Etiquette, a subdivision of the Home Office that no one would officially acknowledge existed, published a slim volume titled Permissible Partings, a guide to taking one's leave without taking a spirit home. It contained no fewer than 17 approved farewells for cemetery use, each ranked by risk of supernatural entanglement. The safest, "shall proceed elsewhere now," was so stiff and joyless that even the living struggled to say it with conviction. The most dangerous, "I don't be a stranger," was printed in crimson ink beneath a skull and crossbones motif. For a time, this seemed to work. The dead, though not precisely satisfied, were at least mollified by the consistency. But language, like ghosts, has a way of evolving beyond regulation. By the turn of the century, the old rules had begun to fray. The dead grew wise to euphemisms. Spirits once content with "eat good evening" now demanded more creative acknowledgments. Mediums reported an uptick in hauntings triggered by entirely new phrases. Take Carrig, which some ghosts interpreted as an invitation to become the listener's problem. Why be safe, which implied danger, thus attracting protective but overbearing specters. And most bafflingly, yem happy birthday, which for reasons no linguist could explain, summoned the spirits of people who had died at parties. The living adapted, as they always did. They mumbled. They hummed. They developed a habit of trailing off mid-sentence, leaving farewells eternally unfinished. Well, I'd best be. Lovely weather, isn't? Lord, you'll give my regards to your... The dead, for their part, seemed to appreciate the ambiguity. An incomplete goodbye, after all, left room for interpretation. And eternity was too long to spend bickering over semantics. Now, if you walk through Highgate as the sun dips below the angel-crowned monuments, you might overhear the odd half-spoken parting between visitors and unseen companions. The words are unimportant. The meaning lies in what goes unsaid. And if you listen very closely, you might just hear the ghosts themselves returning the favor, their whispers curling like mist through the trees, their final words always just beyond comprehension. They too have learned the value of a good exit line. After all, why say good-nighting when silence speaks volumes?